This morning's biblical inspiration for our lesson comes from 1 Thessalonians. You are witnesses, and God also, how holy and righteous and blameless was our conduct toward you believers. For you know how, like a father with his children, we exhorted each one of you and encouraged you and charged you to walk in a manner worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory.
Good morning. We are very blessed this morning to have Lonnie Jones with us. We are doing our parenting seminar. It's on the topic of biblical parenting in a digital world. We were blessed to have him yesterday speaking to us on that topic. And this morning and for the several next sessions that we're going to have, 9:30, 10:30, and 1 o'clock after this as well, Lonnie will be speaking for those. So we are blessed to have him this morning, and I wanted to give a brief introduction to him. Lonnie Jones has been married to his wife Jackie for 39 plus years. He has one adult daughter and 3 grandkids, Gunnar, Rowan, and Gage. His wife Jackie is a retired teacher and volleyball coach. Lonnie has been involved in ministry since 1980 and works in ministry with Meridianville Church of Christ. He's a private practice counselor and consultant, author, and podcaster. He serves as a chaplain for Huntsville Police Department and has worked primarily with the SWAT team for the last 32 years. Lonnie also teaches defensive tactics, rappelling, and crisis intervention and de-escalation. So one of the things I mentioned yesterday is if you are skilled in martial arts, then I bet your kids respect you more. So I'm sure they do, and we're really honored to have Lonnie Jones speaking to us. So without further ado, Lonnie Jones.
It is nice to be with you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm probably not going to stand up here since word got out I'm a spitter and everybody said in the back, you're hosed, I'm sorry. But it's nice to be here. So we're going to do part A this morning. We're going to do something different at Bible class. I'm going to do part A again at the second service, and then we'll finish this lesson at the 1:30 service. Is everybody thoroughly confused? Good. That's what we're designed to do. So the text that we're going to use from is from 1 Thessalonians. Now, this is not necessarily a parenting text, but it's a text that as you read, Paul says something about his conduct when he was in the city of Thessalonica. And if you are a parent, I think this is probably your goal. If you're not a parent, but you're an adult member of a congregation, or you're in a family system, or you work with a team, whether it's your production team at work, or whether it's just you're associated with a group of people, the same thing that Paul said he did as a minister would probably just be good for men to do. The same thing that Paul said he did as a minister in this congregation would be good for women to do. The same thing that Paul said he did in this congregation would be good for just guys who are teenagers to do with their friends. And as we go through this text, you'll find out that the 3 main parts of this lesson are encourage, comfort, and urge. And depending on the translation you use, the gentleman that read the text for us, he used the words exhort, encourage, and urge. All those Greek words are very, very similar to each other. But I think it's a function of parents that we encourage, we comfort, and we urge. That was my function as a youth minister, to encourage, comfort, and urge. That's my function with my grandchildren, to encourage, comfort, and urge. That's my function with the men that I associate with as fellow believers. We encourage one another, we comfort one another, and we urge one another. That's a function I serve with my wife. I encourage her, I comfort her, I urge her. That's one of my roles as a chaplain. When I interface with the police department, I encourage those young officers, I comfort those young officers, and I urge those young officers or have them maintain a certain level of discipline. So in this first translation, Paul says, you are witnesses, and God also, how devoutly, justly, and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you who believe. As you know, we exhorted, we comforted, and we charged every one of you as a father does his own children. See, that's the parenting assumption. Paul says, when I was in your midst, and Paul's a bachelor, Paul didn't have any children. He'll call Timothy and Titus his sons in the faith. But Paul says, when I was with you in a leadership or a mentor capacity, I behaved and I treated you like a father does his children. Well, Paul, you're not married, you don't have kids. How do you know this? Well, the Holy Spirit. This is Holy Spirit inspired. And the Spirit said, this is how a father would behave among the children. So what I did was I encouraged, I comforted, and I urged you. Now, the important part here in this text is that you would walk worthy of God who calls you into his kingdom and glory. If you look at the New Century Version, he says, when we were with you, we lived holy and honest without fault. You know this is true, and so does God. You know that we treated each of you as a father treats his children. We encouraged you, we urged you, and we insisted that you live good lives for God. The Contemporary English Version says, both you and God are witnesses that we were pure, honest, and innocent in our dealings with you as followers of the Lord. You also know that we did everything for you that a parent would do for their children. We begged, we encouraged, and we urged you. So basically you have these three words translated a little differently, but it's basically going to give us parental functions. There are going to be three things that we should be as parents, as leaders, as mentors, and there's three things we should do. The parents are to be devout, just or blameless, depending on the translation you read, or pure, honest, and innocent, or holy and without fault. Basically, Paul said, number one, when I was with you, in order to be a person of influence, in order to be a leader, in order to be a person who had any kind of an impact on you, my behavior had to be consistent. My behavior had to line up so that when you looked at me as an example, it wasn't going to be do as I say, not do as I do. This is the number one predictor of at-risk behavior in young people. If I can sit down in a room with a child of at least governable age, anybody who has got out of concrete thinking and is not in pre-operational thinking, and I sit down with a teenager, I sit down with a middle school student, I sit down with a kid in the 5th grade, and there's crisis there's going on, and there's at-risk spiritual behavior. And what we mean by at-risk spiritual behavior is, are they not going to keep their faith? Are they going to drop away from the church? Are they going to be involved in drugs, alcohol, promiscuity, whatever? If I sit down with a kid of any age, and we're in a private setting, and I say, let me ask you one question, and this is the question: do your parents profess things in public that they do not practice in private? If that child answers in the affirmative, that's a 95% predictor we're going to have at-risk spiritual behavior. Children do not tolerate inconsistency. A child can handle this. Hey, you go down there to that church and you do everything they do, but I'm not going to go with you. Children do okay. I've had lots of children in my youth groups over the years who have had surrogate spiritual parents. Their family of origin parent wasn't interested, wasn't devoted to the Lord, didn't care anything about it, and they said, you go and do it, but we're not going to go do it. I've had lots of children and success in families where the parents said, hey, come with us. We're going to work together. We're going to serve together. We're going to worship together. Kids do okay with that. Kids can't tolerate this. We go to church and we put on a face, we put on a front, and we look this way, we act this way, we talk this way in public, but we don't treat each other or other people well at home. If you have inconsistent, I'm not talking about perfection, but I'm talking about consistency. The things that we say in public, do we practice in private? If a child says, hey, my folks don't live devout, holy, and just, blameless, innocent, without fault. If a child says, hey, my mom and dad are duplicitous in the way they talk in public and the way they act at home. And by the way, that engagement is not necessarily dad to son, mom to daughter, but children watch how mom and dad treat each other. And you may have a great relationship with your children, but if you treat your spouse with disrespect or contempt, then the children pick up on that and they say, hey, this stuff they're talking about, love, honor, and respect, that doesn't mean much because it doesn't actually happen at our house. So the first thing is that parents have to have this job where we make sure we have our act together. The most important thing about social media at your house is what you do with it. You can't tell your kids you can't play on that and you play on yours. You can't tell your kid, hey, no cell phones at the table and bury your face in it. You can't tell your kids, hey, we're going to have family night, and everybody sit in the living room and look at a tablet. Well, if you're playing on your tablet, they'll play on theirs. And so you can't be inconsistent with what you tell your kids on anything. Vocabulary, movies you can watch, books you can read, videos you can see, or how much time you spend on a screen. Children don't tolerate very well parents not being just, devout, and blameless, not being consistent in their values. Now, this is a very interesting thing when you talk about the parental influence. And I've been in youth ministry. I started in youth ministry in the spring of '80. I worked with John Rice at 25th and Noble. John's the guy who started Backwoods Christian Camp. I'm the guy who named it, by the way, in case you didn't know that. But the number one influence of children is their parents. And that's it. Now, we like to think it's other kids. We like to think it's our youth minister, our youth deacon, a popular speaker. No, the number one influence of kids on spiritual development is their parents. Whether they want to admit it or not, that's it. Now, when you look at parenting styles, and this comes from a test called the EPAC test. It's a thing about expectation of parental autonomy and control. So if you look at the northern hemisphere of that thing, you've got permissiveness. At the southern hemisphere, you've got strictness. On one side, you've got hostility, and one side, you've got love. And there's kind of a dichotomy between how much autonomy, letting a child do some things on their own, and how much control, micromanagement you have. This comes from Stephen Glenn's book, Raising Self-Reliant Children in a Self-Indulgent World. And so what happens is when I talk to children and I say, hey, tell me about what happens at your home. Now, this doesn't have to be real. This can be perceived, okay? So tell me what goes on at your house. Children can say, hey, when my parents parent me, they parent me with hostile autonomy. That's on the quadrant that has permissiveness and hostility. Hostile autonomy is basically a parent who is disinvolved with their children, disengaged. I don't care what you do, just don't bother me. A lot of times these are single parents who are into the dating world. A lot of times these are parents who have attachment issues with their kids because they're over-involved in their career or substance abuse. But parents who parent with hostile autonomy are basically, I don't care what you do, just leave me alone. Then there's parents who parent with hostile strictness or hostile control. And those are the very autocratic, almost borderline abusive parents. Okay, the politically incorrect joke is, what do you say to a child that has two black eyes? Nothing. You done told him twice. You know, those are their parents who say, I'm going to threaten you, and I'm going to intimidate you, and I'm going to punish you, and I'm going to control you with fear and intimidation. Then you have parents who parent with excessive autonomy. And the parents who parent with excessive autonomy are basically the parents who don't want their kids to be disappointed. They don't want their kids to be sad, and so they just want their kids to be happy. These are when hippies had kids. You know, I just want you to never be upset. I don't want you to ever have a hard time. I just want you to be happy and at peace. And then you have parents who parent with loving strictness. We call that excessive control. Now, these are not just helicopter parents. These are parents who helicopter parent with an Apache attack helicopter. You're going to make all A's. You're going to be the starting pitcher for the baseball team. You're going to be the starting quarterback. I'm going to write your lattice to leader speeches, and you're going to show how special we are by how special you are. And so when you have this, you end up with kids who are micromanaged. And by the way, those are the kids who kill themselves. Okay? They're the kids who say, I've got to be all A, all American, all the time. And it's not that these kids grew up thinking they can't be good. They grew up thinking they can't be good enough. And so at some point, I try my best, I try my hardest, and my 97 should have been 100. My A- should have been an A+. I struck 4 batters out. I should have struck 5 batters out. And they realize, you know what? I can never be enough. And so since I can work my soul off and Dad and Mom are still disappointed, I could try not at all and Dad and Mom will still be disappointed. Guess which path I'm going to take? So these are the kids who check out on life. These are the kids who give up, drop out of school, and everything. Now, the interesting thing about this test is you start looking at this thing and you start gridding it. You notice this little pie-shaped thing, and I don't know if the laser won't show up on that. You see that little pie shape between about 2 and 4 o'clock on the clock? That's an interesting part of that chart. It's the balance between permissiveness and strictness, heavy on love, in the absence of hostility. That's going to be a very interesting place on our chart, because as you give this test to people and you say, tell me about your family of origin, tell me how you grew up, what is your perception of your home, When people had certain perceptions, this is the environment I grew up in, the researcher said, hey, we can probably look at where a kid ends up on this grid, and we can predict what they're into. We can predict what they'll do. Now, this is correlation, not causation, but the best they did, they could predict with 68% accuracy. Now, if you're not a statistics guy, you're not a numbers guy, 68% is pretty impressive. When my son-in-law was dating my daughter, I took him bow fishing. We went and spent the night on the Tennessee River shooting fish with an arrow. That's really not that easy to do. The fish is not where you think he is. There's refraction in the water. The fish is actually lower. You don't use sights. You have to instinctively shoot. And so we spend the evening on the river shooting fish. My son-in-law is a basketball player. He's the high-scoring player in the history of the school he graduated from. He's a basketball coach now. Well, he'd never bow fished. And I shot his eyes out. It was awesome. So we're driving home from the river that night, and we're driving home, and it's early in the morning. He spent all night, in the backwaters of Alabama with me. He goes, so, Mr. Jones, do you shoot better with a pistol or with your bow? I said, I'm much better with my pistol, son. And he was very quiet for about 30 miles. Well, the next time I got a chance to go bow fishing, he says, I don't really think I want to go. He says, that was really difficult. I didn't do very well. I said, Tyler, what would I have to shoot from the field in a basketball team to play for the NBA? He said, if you could shoot 35% from the field, you could play anywhere in the world. I said, so a multi-million-dollar basketball player only shoots 35% and he gets that kind of money, and you want to shoot a fish every time you shoot at it? He goes, I feel better, let's go. So now we both fish together. 68% accuracy. Somebody says, hey, my mom and dad acted this way. Now, that's their perception. It doesn't necessarily have to be reality. But the child says, this is how my parents parented. Well, this is what we can predict about those children. Children who said, hey, my parents parented with hostile permissiveness, we can predict those children are the ones who use inhalants and hallucinogens. Those parents who said, hey, my parents parented with hostile strictness, on the deep end of it, they're going to use heroin. On the mild end of it, they're going to use alcohol, cocaine, and sedatives. Those parents who said, hey, my parents parented with permissive love. I told you when the hippies had kids, look what those kids do. Well, they smoke weed. And then you get down into this bottom section where it's my parents parented with loving control. Those are the kids who use alcohol, cocaine, and sedatives. All those things are used to reduce stress. All those things are used for a child to go, you know what, I can't be good enough, I can't be smart enough, I can't be brave enough, I can't be fast enough, I can't be strong enough, I can't be pretty enough, I just can't be enough. And that's a prediction. Now, when I did this recently at Meridianville, the kids in our youth group, the parents told me, said, our kids came home and announced what they were into. One of the little girls looked at her dad and said, I'm going to be using cocaine, because she was teasing her dad. This is not for you to pick your thing, okay? Don't start that. But you'll notice that little pie that was in the between 2 and 4 o'clock. When people said, hey, my parents parented this way, and it ended up being clustered in some permissiveness, allowing autonomy with some holding you accountable for your behavior, with love and the absence of hostility. In that little section of the pie, those students had 0 at-risk behavior. Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. That's what that verse describes. Love with nurture and admonition, permission and control, and the absence of hostility. So what you do as a parent and how you behave as a parent is very, very influential on what happens in the lives of our children. So not only are the parents supposed to be something, the parents basically have 3 functions. And those are the 3 functions we're going to talk about for the majority of the day. And that's number 1, encourage, number 2, comfort, and number 3, urge. Encourage is going to be basically how we teach our children to be self-reliant. Comfort is going to be about crisis intervention, and urge is going to be about discipline. So our goal when dealing with young people is to move them from dependence to independence. Now, this is the chart we started out with last night. When a child comes into the world and he is born, he has 0 independence. He can't decide what to do. He can't roll over without your help. He can't control what goes in. He can't control what comes out. Can't control when either one of those things happens. As he gets older, as he moves from birth into the adulthood, the level of his independence increases and the level of his dependence decreases. If you're not producing a child who is developing independence, then you're not doing your goal as a parent. A child's first steps are typically away from their mother, not toward them, because children are seeking independence. Now, the thing that makes this super interesting is the middle of this chart. In the middle of this chart, you'll notice the independence and the dependence have the same basic, they take up the same amount of real estate. That's your teenagers. We call those tweenagers. Those are the people who have 1 foot in the adult world, 1 foot in the child world. They have adult bodies and children minds. They have adult bodies and they're hormonally still developing. Your brain develops at 2 different times in your life at an astronomical rate. Number one, when you're 2 years old. Everybody's heard of the terrible twos? 2-year-olds are why animals eat their young, okay? And so you have these 2-year-olds and their brains begin to develop. Well, that doesn't happen again until you hit adolescence. The average walking around adult in this room has 300 billion, that's with a B, 300 billion dendrites. We have neurological pathways that connect to things. Your brain starts waking up in your teenage years and it says, hey, let's build connections. And the brain says, connections to where? And the brain says, everywhere. And it just blows up. The average teenager in this room has 3 times that many dendrites in their brains. That's why they can use a smartphone. That's why they can write code. That's why they can memorize things. That's why they can, quote unquote, multitask. That's why there's no significant rock music written by anybody under the age of 26. That's why children can do all these things, because their brains are developing at this vast, crazy rate. A teenager is essentially a 2-year-old who can drive and is obsessed with sex, okay? So that's why, I'm sorry, you said here, I didn't, okay? And so they're there. And so you've got this thing where they're almost an adult, but they're still a child, and they got just as much dependence as they do independence, and we expect them to act like adults, but they're wired to be children. They're highly emotion-based. Now, this affects a lot of things in kids, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but so that's the challenging part. So, as a parent, my first function is to encourage. Now, different words are beg, different word is plead, different word is exhort. It comes from a Greek word, and all these Greek words are very, very close to the word Jesus used to describe the Holy Spirit, parakaleo, or the paraclete. And basically it means to call to one side for aid. It fulfills 2 of the 3 perceptions that children have to have in order to be successful in life. The perceptions are, I'm capable, I'm significant, and I can influence what happens to me. When we teach our children that they can do things, and now moms, you're not doing your young men any favors if you don't teach them to cook. You're not doing them any favors if you don't teach them to fold laundry. You're not doing them any favors if you don't teach them to sew or iron. Dads, you're not doing your daughters any favors if you don't teach them how to change a tire, change the oil, or run certain kind of equipment. What we need to be teaching children is that there's things you can do. The purpose of Lads to Leaders, and you guys may or may not be involved in that. The purpose of Lads to Leaders is to teach children skills, not to win prizes, but to teach them skills. So if they're delivering a speech that they didn't write, you're not doing the thing right. Because the thing is to teach them the cognitive processes of organizing material in a way and then presenting it. But if we're doing all the things that we do for our children and we're not teaching them to do anything on their own, we're robbing them of some experiences, because Paul said what we wanted to do was encourage you. Now you think about that word encourage, it's to infuse courage into a person. I'm an advocate of a thing, and I don't think I invented it, but I use the words a lot. I'm an advocate of a thing called intentional adversity. Intentional adversity is simply the idea of I'm willing to do some things that you won't do so I can do some things that you can't do. And that's it. Mark Plemons, I think he lives in this area. Actually, he's a Secret Service agent. He was on the SWAT team with me years ago. And Mark said the only way to run faster is to run faster. Now, it's not any fun to run faster because your legs hurt, your lungs hurt, and you throw up. But if you get out here and you run 3 miles every day, and you run 3 miles every day at the same pace, guess how fast you can run 3 years from now? Same pace. But if you get out here and you wear a weighted vest, you'll do some hill repeats, or you'll start doing some sprints, guess what will happen to your pace? The only way to run faster is to run faster. And having our children participate in things that they are uncomfortable with. By the way, the only way to deal with anxiety is to deal with the thing that makes you anxious. And we have to encourage our children to be involved in things that they don't want to do. When I was a kid, we lived way off the road, and we lived on top of this little hillock. It went out, and it dropped on both sides. And when it dropped off on both sides, there were these pine thickets. And we rented this little house, and we had 3 German Shepherd dogs. We got a dog when we were little, and then she had puppies, and we got to keep a puppy apiece. So I had a dog, my brother had a dog, and my dad basically had a dog. And we kept them in this pen down in the pine thicket. And my job was to water the dogs. Now, if you have looked at me, you can probably tell I'm not very tall. I grew a stunning 4 inches while I was in college. I graduated high school at 5 foot even, okay? So picture me in middle school. My job was to water these dogs. We watered these dogs with those 5-gallon buckets you get from Lowe's. My dad worked at a dairy, so we had 5-gallon dairy buckets. If you've ever carried a 5-gallon bucket and you've been under the height of 5 foot, that's hard to do because those buckets are nearly as tall as you are. A gallon of water weighs 8 pounds. And so my job was supposed to be get these 2 big buckets of water, walk down away from the house, down the big hill, and then water the dogs. And I didn't like to do it and often wouldn't. My dad would come in from work, and when he would come in from work, we'd be sitting there eating supper, and Dad would go, "Did you water the dogs?" No. You need to do it. Now what my dad, well, when you walk down the hill and you go down there, that's where the pine thickets are. You may have never heard of a pine tree monster, but pine tree monsters live in pine trees, by the way. And light is linear, so light travels as a beam. It won't bend and go down that hill. So when you step down that hill and that light from the house is shining, it doesn't make it in those pine trees. And so you get down there in the dark, and you hear things moving around in the tops of those trees. Those are pine tree monsters. And if you look at a pine tree monster, it'll eat you. So you know, when you're walking around and you feel something breathing on your neck, you never turn around. They don't like to be seen. Oh, you're done. They have dinosaur vision. And so if you move real slow, they can't track your movement. So you go down there and you water and then you start walking back toward the house. If you run, you're dead because that vision, and they got you. And man, I'm down there scared to death of that pine tree monster. Didn't want to tell my dad I was scared of pine tree monsters. Didn't want to tell my dad I was scared of the dark. I'd forget to water the dogs. Dad made me go down there. I'd water the dogs, and I'd start walking back up the house. And I'd get up that hill, and just about the time my little head would pop over the hill, my dad would be out on the porch, smoking. Now, in those days, he smoked. He doesn't smoke anymore. Little concrete block house with a yellow light on the side. My dad leaned up against that post smoking. My dad could smoke in the house. But every time I had to water the dogs, he chose to go outside to smoke. You know why? Well, he knew I was scared of the dark. But he never said, you shouldn't be scared of the dark. He never said, you little coward, you're scared of the dark. He never said, well, I know you're afraid, hon. You don't have to go water the dogs. I had a job to do. And just because I was scared and just because it was hard and just because it frightened me didn't mean I didn't get to do the job. But I did it, and he stood out there on the porch while I did it, encouraging me. Pine tree monsters are scared of my dad. They've never, ever come out of those trees when my dad was out on the porch. I'm very, very comfortable in the dark. I hunt. I'm in the woods before daylight. I'm in the woods after dark. I learned how to move at night from a Vietnam-era Green Beret sniper. I don't even use a flashlight when I hunt unless I'm trailing a deer. He told me you look at the horizon, remember the tops of the trees and know where you're going. I walk in and out of the woods all the time in the dark, and the only time I turn my light on in the dark is to look at a blood trail. Well, you know why I'm not afraid of the dark? Because my dad encouraged me. He infused courage. He didn't make excuses for me. He didn't belittle me. He didn't tease me. He didn't make me feel like I was humiliated. But I had a job to do, and Dad said, hey, you're going to do the job. I'll facilitate you doing the job. I'll build you. I won't direct you. And so as parents, our job number one is to encourage our children to be involved in things that make them uncomfortable. And the only way to deal with an anxiety is to face that anxiety. By the way, anybody ever dealt with a kid with panic attacks? Anybody ever had panic attacks? Okay, this means yes. This means no. This means you're not voting, all right? So when you have a panic attack, what happens? Your heart rate runs away. Your breathing changes. You get this really goofy feeling in your stomach. You have a narrowing of vision. You have auditory exclusion, and your muscles get tight. When that happens to your body, is your body working correctly? Yes. Your body's working like God designed it to work. Because when something tells me that I've got to run or I've got to fight something, my body makes me alert, motivated, and strong. How does your body make you alert, motivated, and strong? Well, it drops hormones into your stomach because that's the quickest path to your bloodstream. Oxytocin, norepinephrine, adrenaline, all those things drop into your stomach. Well, now I've got all these hormones in my stomach. I got to get them to different places. What's the fastest way to get stuff in your bloodstream? Well, your heart increases. And if your heart increases, your breathing increases. And then when your heart and your breathing increase and you get all these hormones out of your system, then you're ready to be alert, motivated, and strong. And it doesn't matter if I'm going to run from the bear or fight the bear, I'm alert, motivated, and strong. So when you have a panic, when you have an anxiety attack, nothing's wrong with your body. You're not dying. You're not having a heart attack. There's nothing wrong. Your body is revving its engine so you can do the thing you're supposed to do. But we start avoiding that uncomfortable feeling, and then mom and dad let us say, well, this makes me nervous, this makes me scared, this makes me anxious. Well, sweetheart, you don't have to do it. Well, you're not doing what Paul said he did with these people. I'm encouraging you to expose yourself to intentional adversity. Do hard things. I do the things that you will not do so I can continue to do the things that you cannot do. And learning to make peace with those symptoms. There's a Chinese proverb I love. It says, do not seek silence, but learn to be at peace with the noise. This makes me nervous. And being brave doesn't mean you're not afraid, okay? If you've never been afraid, you're just not very smart, okay? If you've never been afraid, you haven't done a lot. Being brave means I can take the sensation of being afraid and I can control it. I can decide it's not telling me to do something, it's just telling me to do something. Courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is the ability to do what's proper while I'm afraid. Anger management is not don't get angry. Anger management is I'm angry, but I'm not going to sin. I'm angry, but I'm not going to pitch a fit. I'm angry, I'm not going to curse or throw things. And all those things are about us being able to be exposed to intentional adversity. And moms and dads, when we rescue our children from things that make them uncomfortable, we're teaching them to be weak, we're teaching them to be avoidant, and we're teaching them not to have the responsibility that says, hey, I'm capable, and number two, I'm significant. And so at the after lunch session, we're going to talk about, in the next two, we're going to talk about comfort and we're going to talk about urge. We're going to talk about how we can deal with crisis, and we're going to talk just a little bit about some strategies for discipline, especially when it comes to setting limits and behaviors in the digital world, because a lot of times, it makes our children super, super uncomfortable to think about not having the internet. Well, sometimes I have to make decisions for you that are in your best interest. And so as functions as parents, we're going to encourage, we're going to comfort, we're going to urge. Now, as you remember our verse, the very ending part of our verse is that I want you to walk worthy of God who calls you into his own kingdom. So as we wrap up our lesson this morning, let me ask you, as a parent, as an adult, or as a person who has, quote unquote, reached the age of accountability, is your behavior such that you are walking worthy of God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory? That simply means, regardless of what you're doing in grades, regardless of what you're doing in athletics, regardless of what you're doing in industry, I don't care if you're a success there. Are you a success in the thing that matters? That are you walking worthy of God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory? Now, if we're raising our children and we're not raising our children to be Christians, we're failing our children. But this morning, as we end our conversation, question number one is, are you walking worthy of the kingdom? And if you're an adult and you're dealing with children, are you living in such a way that it models that they walk worthy of God in his kingdom and glory? So is your lifestyle devout, holy, and blameless? And are you living in such a way that if your children followed you, they'd follow you to heaven? Are you living in such a way that if another adult followed you, they'd follow you to heaven? Are you living in such a way that you are encouraging people to leave the world of sin and enter into the world of spirituality and living like a person who's a Christian? Now, we'll talk about the rest of the parenting thing this afternoon, Lord willing, but before we leave this assembly this morning, let me ask you that question. Are you living in a way that your heavenly Father believes you're an obedient child? And if you're not an obedient child of your heavenly Father, we offer you the Lord's invitation this morning while we stand together and while we sing.